In fact, I worry somewhat about the Sunday evening programs and have some nervousness about that. And what it does is it goes back to a wonderful couple that I had in the church years ago. I had preached a series of sermons on how my mind has changed, which is kind of what we're modeling on Sunday evenings here. And as I preached this series of sermons, I had walked through some incredibly hard time with the woman in the family, and felt we were pretty close. I loved her husband. He was just wonderful as well, and we were, had great discussions. But when I preached that series of sermons, what fascinated me and also wounded me somewhat is that usually pastors get fired over a number of ways, but often for being prophetic in the pulpit. But I didn't touch politics that day or how power gets used. Rather, it was strictly doctrine. And when the sermon was over, the woman told her husband that she could no longer be in a church where a pastor believed the stuff I did. And so they left. So when we go through these sermons in the Gospel of John, and later when we talk during Lent, I want you to know that God doesn't hold you account for me. You don't have to worry about my soul in theology. I am always working out my theology by the grace of God, and we can be in different places. But when it comes to facing the text, I must do my studying, and I must be honest with you from the pulpit. And thus we begin. And we begin with one of my favorite childhood poems. I've quoted it before. Just the beginning. Strange, this was one of my favorite, given how much I grew over time to hate cats. Pussycat, pussycat, where have you been? I've been to London to visit the Queen. Pussycat, pussycat, what did you there? I frightened a little mouse under her chair. During the Lenten season, we are going to be considering a number of passages from the Gospel according to John. John is, if you don't know yet, you will find out before the season's over, he is first and foremost doing theology, while the other gospel writers are doing narrative. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the text read of the morning, and then we're going to link it with another text that either precedes it or succeeds it, because there are various ways that various people encountered Jesus and saw what Jesus was up to, or perceived that they knew what Jesus was up to. And so we're going to see some contrast of his work and ministry as we move along. You must, if you're going to understand John, this is not one of those things that you can take an either or to. If you're going to understand John, you must be willing to read the text and not get so caught up in the story alone. Because you may be expecting the story to go one way. Like if you didn't know the poem about the pussycat and you started reading the first line and you were sure where it was going, well, that pussycat's going to just be overwrought at seeing the Queen, which means you don't know anything about cats because they're never overwrought about seeing anybody. Or that cat just becomes so delightful that the Queen would have it jump up in her lap and just enjoy it cuddling up. But then most cats don't really like to cuddle unless it's on their terms. Or, at very least, that cat would go all around the throne, rubbing itself on the post of the chair. But if you read the second line, you know, as it turns out, the cat could care less about royalty because the mouse, a.k.a. the food, is under her chair. That's how John is. John's going one way, and you think you know where John's going, and then John takes 2 or 3 different side paths. One final note about John that's of interest to me, maybe not to anyone else here, but since I was an ancient language major, I find it fascinating that John's writing, John's Greek, is some of the easiest to translate you will run into in all of the New Testament. It's smooth. Vocabulary is not a problem. It's just easy to translate, to read. But don't be fooled by the simplicity and directness of the language, because over and over again he will throw curveballs left and right, and there will be double meanings all over the place, which can be exasperating to many. So let's take a look at the first miracle that I want to talk about that precedes this narrative of the day. It is one that we touched base with not too long ago. It is the miracle at the wedding in Cana. The first miracle recorded in the Gospel of John. Jesus comes to a wedding, you know the story, brings his disciples, gets there, and the party's been going on, and the wine's running low, which would be an embarrassment for the family if the wine should run out. Mary leans on Jesus to fix the problem. He resists. He says, no, this is not my problem. It's not time yet. He does all this stuff. But then Mary just keeps telling the people to follow his directions, and ultimately Jesus gives in to Mary, and then the action picks up. So, water was scarce commodity in the Middle East then as it is now. But John notes that there were 6 stone jars, water jars, if you will, but not just any water jars. They were there for a purpose. They held the water for the rites, the Jewish rites of purification. They were pretty important if you were following the law. Orders are followed. By the way, they hold 20 to 30 gallons apiece, lots of water. So, orders are followed, containers filled, instructions given. And when all is done, Jesus orders the steward to draw out, and as we would say back in the mountains where I grew up, take a snort. Voila! Wine. Good wine. Wonderful wine. The best wine possible. So Jesus pulls off his first of his signs in Cana. And it is revealed, according to John, it reveals God's glory. Now, Jesus is fulfilling a theme here, according to John. But it's really John's theme. The late Raymond Brown, who taught for years at Pacific School of Religion, who was a person of great renown and concerning New Testament studies, Raymond Brown and other scholars say that we have this section in which John's telling the stories, but there is this replacement theme going on. And the first sign of replacement is the ritual water, the important water for cleansing. And it is replaced with rich, choice wine. The head waiter's statement at the very end of the scene is, "You've kept the choice wine until now." Well, it's not just about wine. Because according to Brown and others, this is to be understood as the proclamation of the coming of the Messianic days. The choice wine is upon us, is at hand, is in the midst of us. The choice wine, of course, is the one who was doing the miracle, not the wine itself. Now, there are intertestamentary writings, that is, after the last canonized Hebrew book was written, and the first Pauline epistle was written. In between there, writings continued. That's where the Apocrypha came from. Many of you with Roman Catholic roots still know the stories from the Apocrypha. Protestants, well, since there was kind of a rejection by the Reformers, we remain pretty ignorant about that unless you just enjoy good stories, and there certainly are some there. But some of those writings make clear that in the final days, there will be an abundance of wine. I don't know what that could have... Yes, but remember, that's two things. And Jesus to drink it with. Today's story is found in all four Gospels. But in the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story of the cleansing of the temple takes place after the glorious and triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where everybody's exciting, everybody's ready. Oh, Hosanna, Hosanna. And after this glorious parade into town, according to the synoptic writers, Jesus takes off and goes into the temple to purge those who were making money in the temple. Here's what's interesting. We're here in the second chapter of John, and John is putting the cleansing of the temple right up front, right at the beginning, not over after the entry into Jerusalem. And this is an angry Jesus. He intentionally makes that whip. Must have had some weaving classes. And he makes it for a purpose. And what does he do? He whips anything and everything to drive the animals and those who are making the money and anybody in the way out of the temple. Today we wonder, with many scholars, we would ask their questions, did Jesus take a stand here? Right up front against the temple cult, rather than trying to reform it? And when I say temple cult, I mean all of those folk who are part of the sacrificial system. Those who brought the animals and sold them, and those who sold them for sacrifice, and those who did the sacrifice. Even the priests were part of that. Was this Jesus taking a stand, according to John, against the system, the cult? Was the driving out of the animals the protesting of their very presence in sacred space? Was Jesus rejecting sacrifice altogether? There are places in John where we get this anti-temple cult more than a feeling. Sometimes it's pretty explicit in terms of the hints. But it also, in Jesus' day, was present in other communities. The Qumran, Essenes, they didn't have much affection for the temple cult. And some have suggested perhaps Jesus came out of that community, though the Bible really gives us no true evidence of that. The Samaritans had a whole different view of looking at the temple cult. We'll get to that in the story next Sunday. Jesus, according to John, absolutely stands against the ceremonies and rituals that have become intertwined with the economic, political, and religious interests. Jesus is here saying loudly, using different words, I want a divorce. Take these things out of here. They're not aids, they're hindrances. They don't help prayers. They make the prayers more difficult. And then the story unfolds as yet another replacement story. John doesn't tell us why Jesus should have done this. John just assumes that it was a necessary thing. The prophet Jeremiah, 500 plus years earlier, called the temple cult to account when he preached that it was a den of thieves. Not a nice thing to call religious people. The prophet Zechariah had pronounced that on the ideal day of the Lord, that all would be holy in Jerusalem and no merchant could be found in the temple. Pretty much implying that business in the temple was non-existent. So when Jesus quotes the psalm it was quoted about him, that zeal for your house will consume me, he's implying that this zeal will in and of itself bring about his death. John's trying to telegraph early in the story of Jesus. He's trying to telegraph with this reference to the destruction of the temple and its rebuilding in 3 days. It's not just about resurrection, but that Jesus was to become the new temple. That Jesus was the dwelling place of God. That Jesus was the manifestation of God's presence among the people. Now, to bring us together, if any of you have stayed with me this long, let's move to what's left. One of the many battles fought by our spiritual forebears, the reformers, was against relics and rites and religious images that were deemed idolatrous. There are still churches today that don't want any religious art anywhere on the premise, because they came out of that Reformation tradition that says it's idolatrous. And so much beauty was destroyed in the Reformation by reformers who were somewhat clueless. They saw that to be an affront to God. Suspicion of things and claims that these things could possibly represent God. Beautiful art, designed worship spaces, glorious cathedrals that got whitewashed. Later, even Protestants who got themselves in an uproar when they saw somebody using the rosary and praying the rosary. The prayer beads, something so simple. Any human construct was seen as a way of getting in God's way of redemptive work. And here's the problem. Human beings, because this is who we are, this is how we operate, and I think we'll probably talk more about this tonight for those of you who come out. Human beings, well, we need symbols. Language, which we'll talk about tonight, is symbol, no matter what language it is. We make up symbols to represent realities. Human beings need symbols to represent the reality, even the holy realities. We need images and words and prayers. God's known this from the day of Moses. Remember? God ordered the people of Israel on their way out of Egypt to make a glorified box. That's what it was. Forget all your images of Indiana Jones. It was a glorified box. To put the tablets in that glorified box. And here's the other thing. Remember this? Those of you who, like me, you love the Hebrew Scriptures, remember, they believed that God lived where? In the ark, that it was the presence of God in their midst. And they trusted that God was with them because they had the ark in their midst. We always have to have symbols of some kind. I don't believe John's Jesus was damning human limitation. Rather, I believe that Jesus was confronting a people who were just confused about sacrifice, were just confused about who God was and about God's ways and thoughts. I believe that Jesus, who later would be painted by the church, today's story testifies to that, says later when the disciples look back upon this, then they begin in translating or understanding Jesus as this being about the rebuilding of the temple, about resurrection, but that was looking back on it. I believe what's happening here is that Jesus was pushing back against sacrifice, period. This concept of God's demanding blood, having to have blood, or there's no atonement. God sets the rules, and Jesus knew, by the way, that God sets the rules. I believe that Jesus was saying to all of those caught up in this sacrificial, almost madness at the temple, Jesus was saying, no. Jesus was taking a stand with the prophets, because what did the prophets preach hundreds and hundreds of years earlier? That God demands sacrifice? Come on, help me. What did God demand? God demands justice and mercy. And God, at one point, according to the prophets, has said, your sacrifices are a stench in my nostrils. That Jesus was saying, well, the whole sacrificial system is being replaced. 2,000 years have passed, and the church and many of us are still convinced that God has it out for us. And there are some people I think God may have it out for it, but that's just my bigotry. It's not God. It's not the symbols we hold on to that offend God. Rather, it's our rejection of Jesus' being and ministry that points to a God full of grace and glory. At the wedding, John says that the wine replaced the ritual water. Jesus was the wine, and is the blessing at that celebration. Here in the temple, Jesus is demonstrating that appropriation of sign and sacrifice is not just distracting, but it's a mistake. We have symbols sitting here today, and most of you will partake of the symbols. Small pieces of bread. We use grape juice instead of wine, but you could go in any church and it would be wine. Symbols. This is not idolatrous. This is a reminder of who God is and what God is up to in our midst. The presence of God, the real presence of the living Christ. This is a testimony, I believe, that God does not have a big holy hand up there ready to smack us on the side of the head and ship us off to hell. That God is so much bigger than we are, and so much beyond who we are. And that Jesus boldly spoke the word that the sacrificial system was indeed just getting in the way. You don't have to believe what this pastor believes. I never ask you to when you call me. I only try to be faithful to my understanding of where the Gospel of John takes me. And with my studies, this I believe. whatever you believe about Jesus and sacrifice, the end game is the same. God came to live among us, and through the Spirit still does. God dwells among us. And as I said during the assurance, will never let us go. May we hear that good news, no matter how we view the instrument to proclaim it. May it be so.